This is A-level psychology. This is year 2 biopsychology. And this particular video we're going to look at brain plasticity. And what that means is it's how the brain adapts and changes as a result of normal learning experiences. And I find this topic really fascinating because it suggests that as we go about our business every day, we have different experiences, that our brain is physically changing as a result of the things that we do. So, for example, violinists who use their left hand a lot have been found to have a larger area of grey matter in their motor cortex on the right hand side where their fingers are, so where their fingers are controlled rather. So as a result of using their left hand lots and lots, their brain is physically adapting to be stronger and to have more connections, and to basically they end up with a larger cortex. So it's really interesting to hear lots of different examples of this. So the first thing we need to look at is, how does this process actually happen? What is going on in the brain when it adapts to things that we're doing? So one of the key things that happens is called synaptic reweighting. And what this is you've got existing synapses within your brain, and obviously within those synapses you have vesicles containing neurotransmitters. And within the presynaptic neuron, when the synapse is used regularly, what happens is more vesicles appear and more receptors. So you end up, like in this picture here, with a much stronger synaptic connection, because you've got more neurotransmitters being released, and more receptors on the other neuron means that the postsynaptic neuron is more often stimulated, and so on. So you end up with a much stronger connection, and obviously the pathway can be activated a lot faster. So that's one thing that happens, synaptic reweighting. Another thing that happens is called synaptic pruning. This is kind of like the opposite. So when a synapse isn't being used, the vesicles and the receptors reduce until basically nothing happens. So this isn't a very good picture. I've just turned the other picture backwards because I couldn't find a better one. But you can see that the idea that you go from having lots of vesicles and a strong connection to basically it's like a way of the brain being efficient. Connections that aren't being used kind of wither and stop being used. So rather than producing lots of neurotransmitter which would then sit in the presynaptic neuron and do nothing, there's less vesicles, and in the end less receptors, and the synapse would basically stop being used. So those are two processes that can happen. And for example, with synaptic reweighting, that would be what happens when a violinist practices. Those connections in the right motor cortex would be strengthened, would become stronger, and you'd have lots more neurotransmitters crossing the synapse and stimulating the postsynaptic neuron. And then therefore the cortex would become larger. So that's kind of what's happening. But then if the violinist stopped practicing, the opposite would occur. The vesicles would reduce, the synaptic pruning would happen, until that the area in the brain would shrink again. So let's have a little look at some research that shows plasticity. So this is looking at our evaluation. Is this just someone's random idea, or do we have evidence to show that this actually happens? And the first piece of evidence we have is from Boyk, and he looked at 60-year-olds and he taught them a new skill. He taught them how to juggle and got them to practice, and he found that there was an increase in grey matter in their visual cortex. That's obviously, if you think about juggling, they're having to really watch the balls carefully. You can imagine why the visual cortex of the brain would need to grow in order to do that. Those pathways would be activated, the vesicles would increase, there were more neurotransmitters, stronger synaptic connections, synaptic reweighting had occurred. So, and then equally, when they stopped practicing, the changes were reversed. synaptic pruning occurred, and the area of their visual cortex was reduced again. So that's one piece of evidence, and quite an interesting one actually. And then another piece of evidence, it comes from Kuhn. He made a group of people train on video games for 30 minutes a day for 2 months. I bet some of you probably think that sounds like quite a good experiment to take part in. What happened was he compared them with another group who hadn't been training on video games for 30 minutes a day, and they found a significant increase in grey matter in 3 areas: the cortex, the hippocampus, and the cerebellum. So that's quite interesting, because you've got, it's not just one area. Perhaps you'd think, oh, it would be their thumbs, the area that controls their thumbs, that would increase. But actually, if you think about a video game, perhaps it involves more than simply control of your thumbs. You need to be watching the screen. And so, yeah, you can imagine that it would increase various different areas. So that was a significant increase in the experimental group compared to the control group in 3 different areas. So that's quite a nice experiment as well, and quite a recent one, which is good. Then we've got some more research here. This is this is an interesting one, which is slightly different. Davidson compared a group of 8 Tibetan monks with 10 student volunteers. So they got these monks to meditate while they were fitted with electrical sensors. So this is a different way of looking at the brain. They're not scanning the volume of the brain in the same way that they had on the previous ones. In these ones, they'd have had to scan the brain and looked at the increase in the area. In this particular experiment, they're just fitting them with electrical sensors to monitor basically where electrical activity is occurring and what kind of electrical activity is occurring. And what they found was that monks, while they meditated, had more what we call gamma waves. You can see on this diagram here, gamma waves at the bottom. It implies heightened perception. These are you can look down this diagram and see all the different kinds of brain waves, and we'll do these in more detail later when we look at sleep cycles. But what we found in this particular experiment was that the gamma waves, which also coordinate neuron activity, were more present in the monks while they were meditating than the student volunteers. So they basically found that there had been like a long-term change in these monks' brains as a result of them meditating. Their brains were working more efficiently in terms of the electrical signals that were happening. So Davidson concluded that meditation changes the working of the brain and brings about permanent changes. So it wasn't just a temporary change. That's a really interesting one. Although some of you may note the number of volunteers, perhaps it would be better if it were a larger scale study. However, possibly not really easy to get hold of Tibetan monks to participate in psychology studies. But if you were evaluating this in an essay, that is a legitimate point you could bring up. It's a useful experiment to show that the brain waves of these monks had permanently changed and their brains were acting more efficiently. However, whether you can really generalise from 8 Tibetan monks who've had quite a different experience, you could question whether something else had potentially affected their brainwaves. You don't know. So those are some potential evaluation points that you could draw on there. Right, now more research showing plasticity. You'll see that this is, hopefully you're beginning to get the idea that this is quite a well-established thing. It's not just a random theory that some strange person came up with. There's quite a wealth of research that shows that plasticity does happen. So here's another one. Kemperman, he investigated the effect of the environment of rats on the number of neurons in their brain. And he put some in a complex environment, probably a larger environment with more different things to stimulate them. They had an increased number of new neurons in the brain, especially the hippocampus, when compared to a group of rats probably kept just in like a simple cage with very little inside. They're in a simple environment and they have less neurons in the brain. than these other rats who've been put into this complex environment. Their hippocampuses or hippocampi are growing as a result of being in this complex environment. Because new memories have been formed, they're learning how to navigate from one place to another place. So that is another piece of research that shows that our brains physically change as a result of learning experiences in our environment. Okay, Maguire. This is a really key piece of research in this area, and it was a really good piece of research, and we'll probably look at it a bit more. Maguire compared the brains of London taxi drivers with a control group. And obviously, if you think about a London taxi driver, they have to basically hold a map of London in their head. Someone will get in the cab and say, I want to go to this road. They have to know where it is. They have to know how to get there. So there's an enormous amount of stuff they have to hold in their heads. Information and spatial awareness and so on. And what Maguire did was he managed to compare the brains of London taxi drivers with a control group. And what he found was that the posterior hippocampi of taxi drivers was significantly larger than in the control group. And actually, if you took taxi drivers that had been doing it for 30, 40 years, he found that those taxi drivers had larger posterior hippocampi than taxi drivers who'd been a taxi driver for like a few years. So the longer that they were spending as a taxi driver, the bigger this particular area of their brain was. I've put a little picture of a brain here, so just to remind you where the hippocampus is, it's on the bottom part of this structure that's highlighted in the centre of the brain, if you've forgotten. So there we go. That was another really good piece of evidence that we'll have a look at. So in terms of criticism of this theory, we don't really have any pieces of research that say, no, this doesn't happen. There's lots and lots of pieces of research that say, yes, this process is happening, but they're not all perfect. So I guess the key point to remember when you're talking about this is that actually it's really good when we've got loads of different pieces of research in different areas showing different processes having an effect on the brain. And that's perhaps more persuasive than just if you have one really good piece of research. And it's good to remember that. But if you wanted to be evaluating the other side of the argument, you could be picking on those pieces of research a little bit. You could be talking about how there weren't very many Tibetan monks in the sample. You could be talking about the fact that rats were used rather than humans and so on. But the key thing to remember here is that plasticity is a well-established concept with a lot of supporting research to back it up. So that would be the key evaluation point for you to remember on this.